What if I told you that one of wrestling's most controversial championship reigns lasted only 4 days and was never shown on television? In 1981, a young wrestler from Tennessee shocked the world by defeating Harley Race for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. But here's the thing, most fans never even knew it happened. Tommy Rich's story is one of the most mysterious chapters in wrestling history, involving backstage politics, hidden agendas, and a title reign that became both his greatest achievement and his biggest curse. But to understand how we got to that shocking night in Augusta, we need to go back to the beginning. Thomas Richardson was born on July 26, 1956 in Hendersonville, Tennessee. And let me tell you, this wasn't some wrestling hotbed like you might expect. Hendersonville was just a regular small town, but Richardson had this thing about wrestling from early on. He wasn't one of those kids who had wrestling in his family or anything like that. He just watched it on TV and decided that's what he wanted to do with his life. Now keep in mind, we're talking about 1974 when Richardson decided to make his move into wrestling at just 18 years old. That sounds young today, but back then it wasn't that unusual. The territorial system was different. You could walk into a wrestling office as a teenager, and if you had the right look or attitude, someone might give you a shot. But here's the thing, Richardson didn't just walk into any wrestling office. He managed to get the attention of some serious legends in the business. Richardson ended up working with Jerry Jarrett, Jerry Lawler, Dick Steinborn, and Tojo Yamamoto. Now, if you know anything about Memphis wrestling, you know these weren't just random trainers. Under these legends, he learned storytelling, promo work, technical safety, and ring psychology. Jarrett showed him how wrestling was really about telling stories that people cared about. You couldn't just go out there and do moves. You had to make the crowd believe in what was happening. Lawler taught him about the business side and how to work with promoters and other wrestlers. Steinborn focused on the technical stuff, how to work safe but make it look real. Yamamoto brought in this whole different perspective on match psychology and how to build tension in the ring. The training process wasn't some casual thing either. These guys put Richardson through the ringer. They made him practice the same moves over and over until he could do them without thinking. They taught him how to take bumps without getting hurt. They showed him how to cut promos that sounded natural instead of scripted. Most importantly, they taught him how to connect with the audience, which turned out to be his biggest strength. Richardson had something that his trainers noticed right away. He wasn't the biggest guy or the most athletic, but fans saw him as the tough kid brother they could relate to. He came across as genuine in a business where a lot of guys seemed fake or over the top. When he talked, people believed him. When he got beat up in matches, fans actually cared about what happened to him. The Southern wrestling territories in the 1970s were perfect for someone like Richardson. This wasn't the polished corporate wrestling you see today. Everything was based on great promos and personal feuds that felt real to the audience. Matches were physical and often bloody. The whole style prioritized raw emotion and storytelling over technical precision. Richardson's training prepared him perfectly for this environment. His trainers saw something special in this kid from Tennessee. They knew he had the potential to become a major draw in the Southern territories. Richardson could make audiences believe in him even when he was getting his butt kicked by bigger, more experienced wrestlers. That's not something you can teach. Either you have it or you don't. When Richardson made his debut in 1974, he was ready for what the wrestling business would throw at him. His mentors had given him all the tools he needed to succeed. He knew how to work a crowd, how to tell a story in the ring, and how to handle himself backstage. More importantly, he had developed this persona that would soon become known as Wildfire Tommy Rich. The foundation these legends built for Richardson would serve him well as he moved from territory to territory. They taught him that wrestling wasn't just about being tough or athletic. It was about making people care about what happened to you. And Richardson had that special quality that made fans genuinely invest in his success. This early training period set the stage for everything that would come next in his career. And soon enough, that training would be put to the ultimate test on the biggest wrestling stage in the South. That stage turned out to be Georgia Championship Wrestling, where Rich arrived in the late 1970s and walked into something special. This wasn't just another wrestling territory. Georgia Championship Wrestling was on TBS, which meant it was going out to a national audience every week. Most wrestling back then was still regional. But here was this promotion that could reach millions of homes across the country. For a young wrestler like Rich, this was the big leagues. The pressure was real though. The Omni in Atlanta could hold over 16,000 fans and had television cameras everywhere. When you stepped through those ropes at the Omni, you were performing for way more people than just the crowd in the building. You were on national TV, and if you screwed up, everyone would see it. But Rich didn't crack under that pressure. Instead, he seemed to get better when the lights got brighter. Rich's debut in Georgia was something else. The fans took to him right away, which doesn't always happen with new guys coming into a territory. Wrestling fans can be tough to win over, especially in the South where they had their favorites and weren't quick to change their minds. But Rich had this quality that made people want to root for him. He came across as genuine, like he was really fighting for something that mattered to him. The Wildfire persona was perfect for Georgia Championship Wrestling. The promotion was built around raw emotion and personal feuds that felt real. This wasn't pretty wrestling. It was rough and often bloody, and the fans loved it that way. Rich fit right into this style because he could make you believe he was really angry or really hurt. When he got beat up in a match, the crowd genuinely cared about what happened to him next. Rich's rise through the Georgia territory rankings happened fast. He wasn't just another mid-card guy who might get a shot at a title someday. Within his first year, he was already being positioned for championship matches. The Georgia fans could see that this guy was different from the usual wrestlers who came and went. He had that special connection that made them invest in his success. The atmosphere at the Omni helped make Rich's matches feel bigger than they were. That building had this energy that seemed to amplify everything that happened in the ring. When Rich made his comeback against a heel wrestler, the crowd noise was deafening. When he got in trouble, you could feel the tension in the building. Television picked up all of that energy and sent it out to viewers across the country. Rich started racking up championships pretty quickly in Georgia. He became a 3-time NWA Georgia Heavyweight Champion and 7-time Georgia Tag Team Champion, which showed that the promoters saw him as a reliable draw who could carry the territory. That's a lot of title reigns for someone who was still relatively new to the territory. What really made Rich special in Georgia was his feuds with the top heel wrestlers. His rivalry with Buzz Sawyer became legendary and lasted about 2 years. These weren't just matches. They were wars that had fans coming back week after week to see what would happen next. Rich also had memorable feuds with guys like Ole Anderson, Ivan Koloff, and the fabulous Freebirds. Each of these rivalries brought out something different in Rich's character. The last Battle of Atlanta in 1983 was probably Rich's most famous single match during this period. He faced Buzz Sawyer in a fully enclosed steel cage match that many people think inspired the Hell in a Cell concept years later. This wasn't just a wrestling match. It was designed to be the final showdown between two guys who genuinely seemed to hate each other. The match lived up to the hype and became one of those moments that Georgia wrestling fans still talk about today. Rich was generating huge ratings on TBS television during this time. The network executives knew they had something special with Georgia Championship Wrestling, and Rich was one of their biggest stars. His matches consistently drew good numbers, which meant more people were watching wrestling on TBS than they had before. This success helped establish Rich as main event material, not just in Georgia, but potentially on a national level. By the early 1980s, Rich had become one of Georgia's most beloved wrestlers. He embodied everything that fans loved about the territory. He was tough, emotional, and felt like someone they could relate to. His success wasn't just about winning matches or championships. It was about connecting with people in a way that made them care about what happened to him every week. Despite his rapid rise in popularity, many wrestling insiders still considered a world title shot unlikely for Rich. He was seen as a regional star who could draw in the South. But the NWA World Championship was reserved for wrestlers with broader national appeal. This perception would soon be challenged in ways nobody expected, especially when Rich found the perfect partner to take his career to the next level. That partner was gorgeous Jimmy Garvin. And when these two teamed up in early 1981, they created something special in Georgia Championship Wrestling. Garvin's technical precision balanced Rich's fiery brawling, creating unpredictable matches fans craved. These two guys couldn't have been more different. Rich was this emotional wrestler who wore his heart on his sleeve, while Garvin was smooth and calculated, calling himself gorgeous for a reason. The partnership came together when both guys were established singles wrestlers in Georgia who had actually been opponents before becoming tag partners. Rich had already proven himself as a fan favorite who could get the crowd going crazy. Garvin had this cocky persona that fans loved to hate. When they started working together, something clicked that nobody really expected. Their contrasting styles created both chemistry and occasional friction, which actually made their partnership more interesting to watch. Rich would want to keep fighting when Garvin thought they should take a step back. Garvin would try to slow things down when Rich wanted to keep the pace going. But that tension made their matches feel more real than most tag team wrestling at the time. Let's take a look at their feud with the fabulous Freebirds, which became legendary in Georgia wrestling. During one particularly memorable match at the Omni, Rich got busted open early and was bleeding all over the ring while Garvin tried to keep the Freebirds from taking advantage. The crowd was going crazy as Rich kept fighting despite the blood, and when he finally tagged in Garvin for the hot tag, the place exploded. Garvin came in fresh and used his technical skills to turn the tide, but it was Rich's refusal to quit that made the moment special. Their championship runs drew huge crowd reactions that showed just how over they were as a team. When Rich and Garvin won tag team titles, the Georgia fans went absolutely crazy. You could feel the energy in the building when they made their entrance together. The crowds knew they were going to see something special when these two guys worked together. The teamwork they developed over time was impressive to watch. Rich would set up opponents with his aggressive style, then Garvin would come in and finish them off with more technical moves. They had this sequence where Rich would get the crowd fired up with his comeback, then tag in Garvin, who would use his wrestling skills to put the match away. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective, and the fans bought into it completely. Keep in mind that their success as a tag team was happening during Georgia Championship Wrestling's peak years on TBS. This meant their matches were being seen by wrestling fans all across the country, not just in Georgia. The exposure they got from working together helped both guys build their reputations on a national level. Other promoters started taking notice of what they were doing in Georgia. Their mutual respect came through in the ring, which helped them work better together despite their different personalities. They understood each other's strengths and weaknesses, and they weren't trying to steal the spotlight from each other. That kind of chemistry is rare in wrestling, especially between guys with such different approaches to the business. Their partnership established Rich as main event material in a way that his singles work hadn't quite accomplished yet. Working with Garvin showed that Rich could adapt his style to work with different types of wrestlers. He proved he wasn't just a one-dimensional brawler. He could tell stories in the ring and work as part of a team when needed. This versatility made promoters see him as someone who could work with anyone. The success Rich had as part of this tag team prepared him for bigger opportunities down the road. He learned how to work longer matches and how to pace himself better. Garvin taught him things about ring psychology that helped him become a more complete wrestler. All of these skills would become important when Rich got his shot at singles stardom. Their partnership proved that sometimes the best tag teams are made up of wrestlers who complement each other rather than wrestlers who are exactly alike. Together, they created something that was bigger than either of them could have achieved on their own. But by early 1981, Rich was ready to step out on his own again. And nobody could have predicted what was about to happen next in his career. April 27, 1981, at a non-televised house show in Augusta, Georgia. Most wrestling fans have no idea this date even matters. But it's the night that created one of wrestling's biggest mysteries. Tommy Rich was scheduled to face Harley Race for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, and few insiders expected him to dethrone Race. This wasn't some big pay-per-view or televised special. It was just another house show in a mid-sized Georgia city, the kind of event that happened dozens of times every year across the wrestling territories. The build-up to this match was pretty standard stuff for the time. Rich was a popular regional star who had proven himself in Georgia Championship Wrestling, but he wasn't considered World Championship material by most people in the business. The NWA World Championship was the most prestigious title in professional wrestling back then. You didn't just hand it to local favorites or guys who were over in one territory. The champion had to be someone who could travel anywhere in the country and draw money against the top stars in every territory. Let's take a look at what Rich was up against that night. Harley Race wasn't just another champion. He was a multi-time NWA World Champion and one of the toughest, most legitimate competitors in the entire wrestling business. The guy had this reputation for being nearly impossible to beat. Race was built like a tank and wrestled like one too. He came from that old school where wrestlers had to prove themselves the hard way, and he didn't lose very often. Race's dominance as champion made him this larger-than-life figure that fans respected even if they didn't like him. When you went up against Harley Race, you knew you were in for a fight. He wasn't going to make things easy for you. and he certainly wasn't going to just lay down and let you win. The guy took pride in being a fighting champion who could beat anyone put in front of him. That's what made Rich's challenge seem so unlikely to succeed. The match itself took place in front of a crowd that probably expected to see Rich get beaten pretty badly. Augusta wasn't a huge wrestling town, but the fans who showed up knew what they were watching. They understood that this was their local hero getting a shot at the biggest prize in wrestling. Most of them probably hoped Rich would put up a good fight and maybe look competitive before eventually losing to the superior champion. But something incredible happened that night. Rich didn't just compete with Race, he actually beat him. The moment when Rich pinned Harley Race and won the NWA World Championship was one of those wrestling moments that seemed impossible. The crowd went absolutely crazy because they had just witnessed their guy achieve something that nobody thought was possible. For Rich himself, this had to be the greatest moment of his entire life up to that point. Rich's emotional response to winning the title showed just how much this meant to him. Later, he would call this victory one of the biggest things in his life, which makes sense when you think about what he had just accomplished. A young wrestler from Tennessee had just defeated one of the most feared champions in wrestling history. It was the kind of moment that wrestlers dream about their entire careers, and Rich had actually made it happen. Keep in mind that title changes in the NWA were rare events back in 1981. The World Championship didn't change hands very often, and when it did, it was usually a big deal that got lots of attention from wrestling fans and the wrestling media. Championships were protected more carefully back then, especially the NWA World title. You didn't see shock title changes happening just to surprise people or create controversy. But here's where things get really strange about that night in Augusta. Despite the historical importance of this match, it was never televised. Think about that for a second. One of wrestling's most prestigious championships changed hands, and nobody filmed it. There was no television coverage, no videotape, nothing that would let fans who weren't there that night see what actually happened. Rich only appeared post-match on the Saturday GCW show, which made the whole situation feel even more secretive. The lack of television coverage meant that most wrestling fans never saw Rich win the championship. This was during an era when Georgia Championship Wrestling was on TBS every week, reaching millions of viewers across the country. But somehow, this hugely important match happened away from the cameras. That decision would contribute to the mystique and controversy that surrounded Rich's title reign. The absence of any visual record of the match made Rich's championship win feel almost mythical. Wrestling fans started hearing about this guy from Georgia who had beaten Harley Race, but they had no way to actually see it happen. The story got passed around through wrestling magazines and word of mouth, but there was no proof beyond the people who were actually there that night. What happened next would make that mysterious victory even more controversial. Rich's championship reign lasted exactly 4 days, from April 27th to May 1st, 1981, and those 4 days created chaos behind the scenes that nobody was prepared to handle. The moment word spread through the tight-knit wrestling community that Rich had beaten Harley Race, promoters started making phone calls trying to figure out what was going on. The NWA board members who controlled the World Championship weren't expecting this title change to happen, and most of them probably didn't even know Rich was getting a shot at the title until after it was over. Keep in mind that championship decisions in the NWA required approval from the board of directors. The world champion couldn't just drop the title to anyone without getting permission first. But somehow Rich had beaten Harley Race for the championship, and now everyone had to deal with the consequences. Different factions within the NWA tried to figure out their next move as conflicting stories emerged about what had really happened. Race claimed the whole thing was orchestrated to benefit promoter Jim Barnett, who was attempting to gain more control in the Georgia territory. Rich himself told a completely different story, saying it was actually Race's idea to drop the title to him, and that Race even put up a $10,000 deposit to make sure the title change happened. Jim Cornette had his own theory, suggesting that Rich's title win was a reward for being the most popular babyface in the country and for generating high ratings on TBS. The reaction from key figures in the wrestling business was mixed at best. Some people thought Rich was a good choice because he was over with the fans and could draw money. Others felt like he wasn't ready for the responsibilities that came with being world champion. The NWA World Championship wasn't just about being popular in one territory. You had to be able to travel everywhere and work with all the top stars in different regions. Rich's experience as champion during those 4 days was probably surreal. He later admitted that he may not have been fully prepared for what came with holding the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Rich said he was probably not the most responsible person at that time, which gives you an idea of what his mindset was like back then. The pressures and temptations that came with being the top star in wrestling might have been too much for him to handle at that point in his life. The inevitable title change back to Race happened just as quickly and quietly as the original switch. On May 1st, 1981, in Gainesville, Georgia, only 4 days after Rich had won the championship, Race got the title back. This reversal happened with even less fanfare than the original title change. Most wrestling fans had no idea that Rich had ever been champion in the first place, so they definitely didn't know when he lost it. The secrecy and cover-up that followed the quick reversal made the whole situation even more mysterious. Wrestling magazines barely mentioned Rich's title reign. There were no big announcements or explanations about what had happened. The wrestling establishment seemed to want everyone to forget that Rich had ever been world champion. This silence only made fans more curious about what had really gone on behind the scenes. Let's take a look at why this story became so controversial over the years. The lack of televised coverage meant there was no visual proof that Rich had ever been champion. Wrestling fans started hearing rumors about this guy from Georgia who had beaten Harley Race, but they couldn't verify it themselves. The rapid title change back to Race made it seem like something had gone wrong that the wrestling business didn't want to talk about. The truth behind Rich's 4-day reign remains one of wrestling's most debated mysteries even today. Every person involved tells a different version of what happened and why. The conflicting stories and the secrecy surrounding the whole situation have kept fans and wrestling historians arguing about it for decades. Nobody can agree on whether Rich deserved the title, whether he was ready for it, or whether the whole thing was just a political mistake that got covered up as quickly as possible. This brief moment as world champion would end up defining Rich's entire career in ways that nobody could have predicted, creating both opportunities and obstacles that would follow him for years to come. How do you build a career when your greatest achievement is something most fans never saw? That's exactly what Tommy Rich had to deal with when he returned to regular competition in Georgia Championship Wrestling. He was a world champion no fans saw, a distinction only insiders knew he held. Wrestling fans who watched Georgia Championship Wrestling on TBS every week didn't know about his title win in Augusta. They just saw Rich as the same popular regional star he had always been. The situation created this weird dynamic where Rich was technically a former world champion, but he couldn't really use that fact to promote himself. Behind the scenes, people in the wrestling business knew what had happened, but they weren't talking about it publicly either. This added a layer of mystique to his character that wasn't there before. Wrestling insiders knew about his accomplishment, which gave him more credibility when dealing with other wrestlers and promoters. But he couldn't openly reference being a former world champion because that would bring up questions about why nobody had seen it happen. Rich's continued success in Georgia throughout the 1980s showed that he didn't need the world title recognition to remain a major star. The brief championship reign actually enhanced his booking position in subtle ways. Promoters knew they had a former world champion on their roster, even if they couldn't advertise it that way. This gave Rich a certain gravitas in storylines and feuds that other regional stars didn't have. The mystique surrounding his secret accomplishment affected how fans perceived him too. There was something different about Rich's presence that people couldn't quite put their finger on. He carried himself with a confidence that suggested he had achieved something special, even if audiences didn't know exactly what it was. This mysterious quality made his character more compelling and helped maintain his position as one of Georgia's top draws. Let's take a look at how this played out in his most famous feud during this period. The last Battle of Atlanta, in 1983, drew record TBS numbers, proving that Rich was still a major television draw for the promotion. This fully enclosed steel cage match against Buzz Sawyer is considered by many people to have been an inspiration for the Hell in a Cell concept that WWE would use years later. Even without being able to promote himself as a former world champion, he could still get fans to tune in and watch him compete. Rich's championship success during this period helped cement his position as one of Georgia's top stars. He won the NWA Georgia Heavyweight Championship 3 times, which showed that the promoters still saw him as someone who could carry the territory. He also captured the NWA Georgia Tag Team Championship 7 times with different partners. That's a lot of title reigns for someone whose biggest accomplishment was supposed to be a secret. The impact of his brief NWA World Championship reign was complicated in ways that probably affected Rich for years. On one hand, he had achieved something that most wrestlers never get close to, He had beaten one of the toughest champions in wrestling history and held the most prestigious title in the business. But on the other hand, almost nobody knew about it, which made it feel less meaningful than it should have been. This disconnect between his actual accomplishments and his public recognition created a strange situation where Rich was both overqualified and under-recognized at the same time. He was working matches in Georgia as a regional star when he was technically a former world champion. That had to mess with his head and affect how he approached his career going forward. Despite all the weirdness surrounding his title reign, Rich remained a major figure in Georgia Championship Wrestling throughout the decade. He became a massive draw across the Southern Territories, connecting with fans through his charisma and brawling style. His feuds were memorable, his championship reigns were successful, and his unique circumstances only added to his mystique as a performer. But the wrestling business was starting to change around Rich in ways that would affect everyone who worked in the territorial system. National promotions were getting bigger and more powerful. Television was becoming more important. The old way of doing business that had made Rich a star in Georgia was slowly disappearing. Corporate buyouts were beginning to reshape the wrestling landscape, and soon Rich would discover what happened when regional legends faced a business that was thinking much bigger than individual territories. The Jim Crockett Promotions buyout of Georgia Championship Wrestling in 1984 changed everything for wrestlers like Tommy Rich. This wasn't just another business deal. Crockett was really after that valuable TBS television time slot that Georgia Championship Wrestling had been using for years. That weekly television show reached millions of homes across the country, and having national television exposure was like having a license to print money. Most wrestling promotions back then were still regional, but this acquisition marked the end of an era for Southern wrestling. The takeover transformed how wrestling worked in Georgia completely. For years, Georgia Championship Wrestling had been this independent territory that did things their own way. They had their own stars, their own style, and their own relationship with the fans. But when Crockett took over, all of that started disappearing. The new ownership wanted to create something bigger that could compete on a national level, which meant the personal touch that had made Georgia special was getting lost. Let's take a look at how storylines changed under the new management. Instead of the blood feuds between wrestlers like Rich and Buzz Sawyer that felt genuinely personal, the focus shifted to creating nationally marketable characters with broader appeal. The gritty realism that had made Southern wrestling special was being replaced by entertainment-focused storylines designed to work for audiences who didn't know the local history or personal rivalries that had driven the old territory system. Rich's brawling style and natural charisma had been perfect for the old Georgia system, but they didn't align with the new entertainment-driven focus that corporate wrestling demanded. The emotional connection he had built with fans over years of personal feuds didn't translate as well to a national audience that didn't understand his history or what made him special. His tough guy persona had worked great in the territorial system, but it didn't stand out as much in this new environment where everyone was trying to be bigger and more colorful. The changes hit guys like Rich pretty hard because they had to adapt to this shifting landscape whether they liked it or not. Instead of being one of the top guys in a regional territory, Rich was now just another wrestler in a much bigger company. The personal relationships he had built with fans over the years didn't matter as much when the focus shifted to reaching a national audience that had no connection to his Georgia legacy. Keep in mind that Rich wasn't the only one struggling with these changes. Wrestling was moving away from the territorial system that had created stars based on their connection with local audiences. The new national promotions wanted wrestlers who could appeal to everyone, which often meant the unique qualities that made regional stars special got lost in the shuffle. Guys who had been main event stars in their territories found themselves competing with wrestlers from all over the country for attention. Rich's position during this transition was complicated because he was caught between two different eras of wrestling. He had the experience and credibility from his time as a top star in Georgia, but he also had to learn how to work in a completely different environment. The corporate structure meant less personal control over his character and storylines. Decisions were being made by people who didn't necessarily understand what had made him popular in the first place. The broader impact on regional wrestling during this period was massive. The Jim Crockett Promotions buyout was just one example of how the wrestling business was consolidating. Small territories were being absorbed by bigger companies, and the unique flavor that each region had developed over the years was getting homogenized into something more generic. Regional legends found themselves having to prove their worth all over again in systems that didn't value the same things that had made them successful. By 1989, Rich had become just another mid-carder in the merged promotion, a far cry from his days as Georgia's top babyface. His reputation as a former world champion couldn't help him much because most fans still didn't know about his 4-day title reign. The new corporate wrestling environment had different priorities and different ways of measuring success, and Rich was about to discover just how differently things worked when major promotions completely failed to understand what they had in front of them. When Tommy Rich joined World Championship Wrestling in 1989, he should have been a major acquisition for the company. Here was a guy with a legendary reputation in Georgia, a former world champion, and someone who had proven he could draw money and connect with fans. But WCW management seemed to have no idea what they had on their hands. Rich's arrival in WCW actually started with some promise. Eddie Gilbert introduced him on the June 24, 1989 episode of World Championship Wrestling, and Rich announced his intention to challenge Lex Luger for the US Heavyweight Championship. That sounds like they were positioning him for a main event push, right? You'd think a company would want to capitalize on having a former NWA World Champion on their roster, especially one who was already popular with their core audience. But that promising start faded fast. By July 29, 1989, Rich was already losing to the skyscrapers, showing management's early decision to stall his momentum. Instead of building on Rich's established reputation and connection with Southern wrestling fans, WCW management relegated him to mid-card status almost immediately. This was a guy who had been a main event star in Georgia Championship Wrestling, drawing huge ratings on TBS and selling out arenas across the South. Now he was being treated like just another wrestler who needed to prove himself all over again. WCW's failure to understand Rich's value was part of a bigger problem with how corporate wrestling approached territorial-era wrestlers. The promotion was focused on pushing newer talent like Ricky Steamboat, Terry Funk, Brian Pillman, and the Great Muta. These guys were getting the spotlight, while veterans like Rich were pushed to the side. It's like WCW forgot that their audience included tons of fans who had been watching Rich for years and would tune in specifically to see him. So here's what happened when Rich got stuck in those mid-card roles and enhancement talent positions. Instead of being featured in meaningful storylines that showcased his charisma and brawling ability, he was being used to make other wrestlers look good. Rich went from being one of the most popular wrestlers in the South to being a guy who showed up to lose matches and help establish newer talent. That had to be incredibly frustrating for someone with his track record. Let's take a look at some specific examples of how WCW wasted Rich's name, recognition, and experience. His involvement with the York Foundation miscast him as a heel when his natural persona was as a fan favorite, completely undercutting what made him special. Keep in mind that this heel turn led to a series of losses that further diminished his impact. He was losing matches to guys like Johnny B. Bad, Big Josh, and Ron Simmons. These weren't competitive matches that made both wrestlers look good. They were squash matches that made Rich look weak. The broader problem of corporate wrestling ignoring regional history was everywhere in WCW during this period. The company didn't seem to understand that wrestlers like Rich came with built-in fan bases and established reputations that could be valuable assets. Instead of leveraging Rich's history and connection with Georgia wrestling fans, they treated him like a blank slate who needed to start over from scratch. Rich did have some brief moments of success during his WCW run that showed what could have been done differently. In 1990, he had a televised victory over Cactus Jack and beat Bam Bam Bigelow via disqualification. These wins proved that fans still responded to Rich when he was presented properly. But then his momentum got killed by a loss to Harley Race at Great American Bash 90, which announcer Jim Ross considered an upset. His partnership with Ricky Morton and the Junkyard Dog to win the WCW World Six-Man Tag Team Championship in 1991 should have been a launching pad to re-establish him as a major player. Instead, the partnership dissolved quickly and became another missed opportunity to capitalize on Rich's name value and connection with fans. Rich's WCW career ended in 1992 with a loss to Vinny Vegas at Clash of Champions 18. That's how one of the South's biggest wrestling stars finished his run with the company, losing to Kevin Nash in one of his early gimmicks. The whole thing represented everything wrong with corporate wrestling's approach to regional legends. WCW's mishandling of Tommy Rich showed they didn't understand their own audience or the value of wrestling history. They had a former world champion with deep connections to their core fan base, and they turned him into enhancement talent. This failure to capitalize on established stars contributed to WCW's eventual problems connecting with wrestling fans who remembered the territorial era. These professional disappointments during what should have been a career renaissance took a serious toll on Rich personally, creating pressures that would soon manifest in ways that went far beyond just wrestling. The wrestling industry's culture of substance abuse became Rich's biggest enemy off-camera. Rich openly admitted to battling alcohol and partying, issues that were intensified by the pressures inherent in the wrestling business. The culture of substance abuse was pervasive during this era, with pills readily available backstage like Halloween candy. One account describes Rich's excitement upon receiving a handful of pills from fellow wrestlers, which shows you just how normal this kind of thing had become in wrestling locker rooms. The demanding lifestyle of a professional wrestler, with constant travel and physical demands, often led to wrestlers self-medicating to cope with pain and stress. This created a cycle of dependency that was difficult to break, and Rich wasn't immune to these pressures. The lack of readily available mental health support made things worse, leaving many wrestlers to struggle in silence. Keep in mind that Rich's career disappointments and the burden of his lost championship affected him mentally in ways that probably made his substance abuse problems worse. Think about it. He had beaten Harley Race for the NWA World Championship, but he couldn't even talk about it publicly because it had been kept secret. That kind of psychological burden would drive anyone to drink or use drugs to cope with the frustration. The consequences of Rich's substance abuse extended beyond his personal life and started impacting his professional trajectory. His erratic behavior, fueled by addiction, made it difficult to maintain a consistent career path and damaged his standing within the industry. This was particularly evident in his later years as he struggled to adapt to the changing wrestling landscape while dealing with his personal demons. Let's take a look at how bad things got for Rich during his worst periods. In 2011, when Rich was in his mid-50s, he was involved in a backstage altercation with independent wrestler JP Magnum. This incident highlighted that his struggles with addiction continued into his later years, even as the wrestling business evolved and attempted to modernize. It served as a stark reminder of the ongoing challenges he faced. Rich's multiple attempts at rehabilitation showed that he understood he needed help, even if recovery wasn't easy. He attended a rehabilitation facility called the Greenhouse in Dallas twice within a single year, which demonstrates just how serious his commitment to getting clean really was. Going to rehab twice in 1 year tells you that he was really fighting to overcome his problems, even when it didn't work the first time. The challenges of recovery for someone like Rich were complicated by his entire identity being tied up in wrestling. This was a guy who had been in the business since he was 18 years old. Wrestling wasn't just his job, it was his whole life. Learning how to live without substances while staying connected to an industry that had enabled his addiction required him to completely change how he approached everything. During his time in rehab, Rich engaged in serious introspection, acknowledging the lack of accountability he had experienced in his younger years and the havoc he had wreaked on his own life and the lives of his family. This self-awareness was a critical component of his recovery process because it allowed him to confront the root causes of his addiction instead of just treating the symptoms. Rich's battle with addiction was both deeply personal and representative of wrestling's darker side during that era. His story wasn't unique. It was repeated by dozens of wrestlers from his generation who struggled with similar issues while the industry looked the other way. By 2021, those who knew Rich reported that he appeared lucid and had achieved lasting sobriety, a remarkable transformation that allowed him to continue contributing to the wrestling business he loved. This recovery not only improved his personal well-being, but also enabled him to share his knowledge and experience with the next generation of wrestlers. Rich's journey from the heights of championship glory to the depths of addiction and back to sobriety represents something much bigger than just one wrestler's personal struggles. Tommy Rich's story isn't just about one man's rise and fall. It's about an entire era of wrestling that's been lost to time. The territorial system created legends like Rich who connected with fans on a personal level, but it also created the political chaos that made his 4-day championship reign possible. His mysterious title win remains a symbol of how the wrestling business operated behind closed doors during that period. Most fans only learned about Rich's reign decades later, when DVDs and wrestling magazines finally circulated the story of wrestling's lost champion. Today, Rich continues to train wrestlers and share his knowledge through his wrestling school, proving that redemption is possible even after the darkest chapters. The wrestling world has recognized his contributions through Hall of Fame inductions, including the NWA Hall of Fame in 2008 and the Memphis Wrestling Hall of Fame in 2021. Let me know in the comments if you knew about Rich's championship reign back when it happened, or if you've ever seen any rare footage from that mysterious night in Augusta. Rich's tale offers a fascinating window into wrestling's territorial era politics and passion. Like and subscribe for 100 years of luck. Until next time.